Before I get started, I want to tell you what I mean by degrowth. I think what most of us who are engaged in this have some variation on this theme. Degrowth is a controlled or planned contraction of human economic activity toward a sustainable, equitable, steady state within the means of nature. So it represents a level of economic activity that is compatible with the productive capacity of the ecosystems upon which we are dependent. So we have a situation in which one species on the planet, like all others, is part of the larger whole called the ecosystem. But our species has the myth of perpetual growth and technology to aid and abet that myth. And what it has meant is that the scale of the human enterprise has far exceeded in its consumptive capacity the ability of the ecosystems that sustain us to regenerate themselves. So if you think about it, every major fish stock on the planet is in a state of decline. Agricultural soils we treat in our culture the same way we do a mine. We don't husband our soils, we mine them. So that if you look back to the turn of the 19th century, southern Manitoba, Saskatchewan had the richest Chernozem soils on the planet. But in just over 100 years of industrial agriculture, we have consumed and dissipated over half of the organic material and natural nutrients that required some 10,000 years of post-glacial soils building process to accumulate. In most of the world's major agricultural areas, where they are dependent on groundwater, the groundwater tables are falling much more rapidly than they can be regenerated. So in parts of India and China and the United States, the Ogallala Reservoir, which produces so much of the food upon which we are depending, these water tables are falling meters per year. And in some places, the drills can't keep up, so that agricultural land is going out of production.
So half of that cropland is being used, diverted away from feeding humans directly. It's being used to feed our animals, which then we consume. So 9 pounds of grain to produce 1 pound of meat, for say. So that's why red meat consumption is such a big part of our food footprint. And then it's followed by dairy products, which are very high energy intensity in dairy. Think about pasteurization, cooling, that kind of thing. Transportation's not a big part of that. Grains, nuts, legumes, fruits and vegetables, etc. So if you wanted to get to one planet living, what the data is telling us is that changes in our diet are actually a very powerful way to reduce the footprint.
And it's not just about consumption overwhelming the replacement and reproductive capacity of nature. We're overfilling waste sinks as well. How many of you heard of climate change? Okay. Climate change is a waste management problem. Okay. Climate change is a waste management problem in the proximate sense, because it's primarily driven at this point, although there's other gases catching up, by carbon dioxide, which results from the burning of the energy I talked about earlier, which is part of every kind of economic activity. Now, carbon dioxide, most people weren't even aware that it was a waste until about 4 or 5 years ago, but it always has been. Carbon dioxide, listen, is the single largest waste by weight in every industrial economy. So we can think all we like of the waste, that we dispose of in our kitchens and bathrooms and through the garbage system and so on and so forth. Trivial compared to the sheer mass of carbon dioxide. And it stands to reason because one of the largest inputs to the industrial economy is carbon-based fuel, coal, oil, natural gas. And in the burning of those things, the carbon is converted to carbon dioxide, which goes into the atmosphere. We don't see it the same way we do when we take out a pail of garbage, but the sheer volume of carbon dioxide exceeds any other waste product produced in industrial economies. It's driving climate change. It therefore is an example of a waste sink overflowing. The whole of the ecosphere is no longer capable of assimilating the total loss of carbon dioxide, or production of carbon dioxide. Normally, it's taken up by photosynthesis, and in a system that is compatible with nature, the rate of production of carbon dioxide by living systems is exactly balanced by the rate of assimilation by photosynthesis in green plants, and it is recycled through the process. But a rogue species has come along that is using carbon-based fuels.
Operation of motor vehicles is the dominant driver in the transportation component of our footprint. It's more than half. Commercial vehicles aren't so bad. Transit is really small. We could double, triple, quadruple the energy intensity in the transit system, and we'd have no problems with that. Air travel is significant, and the embodied energy in our vehicles is significant. So not only would we need to get out of our cars, we'd also have to reduce the amount of cars that we own to get away from that embodied energy in the fleet, as well as think a lot about how much air travel we do.
So the point then that I want to make is that we are a rogue species that have broken from the natural negative feedbacks that would normally keep a species in check by virtue of our high intelligence and our ability to manipulate materials and energy to very narrow human purposes. And this has become hugely problematic. So tonight we're here to talk about the idea of why degrowth. I've already defined it, and again, I want you to get this clear. Degrowth is the purposeful contraction of the economy in a controlled manner until it is a sustainable, steady state in which there is a more or less equitable distribution of the products of the economy. It doesn't have to be completely equal, but we should not have on this planet 1 billion people in poverty and another 1 billion suffering from obesity. There's a clear imbalance there. So we need equity within the means of nature. And we're still at the point where it's just marginally possible. So that's the goal of the degrowth rhetoric, as it were. Why, pardon me, why degrowth? Because it's a hell of a lot better than the alternative. And that's, well, one of the ways we've used intelligence is in the application of technology to grow the economy. And we've been remarkably successful. These are simply graphs to show the exponential explosion of just about everything to do with human beings since the 1700s, okay? Particularly since about the middle part of the 19th century. That's when we got into fossil fuels in a big way. And I want to make the point that fossil fuels are really the basis for the entire explosion of human numbers, the entire explosion of all the artifacts associated with human activity. Fossil fuel is the means by which we acquire all other resources needed to grow the human enterprise. We've gone in just 150 years from a point in which 100% of the caloric content of a plate of food was solar energy, harvested through animal and human labor, which was really secondary solar energy, to the point where now 90 out of 100 calories on your plate is a product of fossil fuel, fertilizers, pesticides, irrigation, and so on and so forth. So this dependence is complete. This building is a product of fossil fuel. Modern cities are impossible in the absence of fossil fuel. And all of the artifacts associated with urban life, as illustrated by the previous slide, are the result of fossil fuel. We are now, however, in a state of overshoot. I emphasize this in my introductory remarks. We've reached the point where, by many measures, we are using the Earth at about 50% faster than it can regenerate.
A paradox, most of you are probably aware, it's a statement that conflicts or confounds common sense, but nevertheless is true. Okay? So the first one is the paradox of efficiency. So, we think that technological innovation is going to enable us to use resources more efficiently, and that's a good thing because we can do more with less. But the paradox, so here's your technological innovation, but the paradox is the rebound effect, which, as Jevons articulated in 1856, so again, no new knowledge here, it is as we conserve resources for a short period of time through efficiency benefits, but then as prices drop, the access to those resources increases to a broader spectrum of people, and demand ultimately ends up going up again. We find new opportunities to use these cheaper resources, so in the end, we use more. So here, we became more efficient in our use of lighting, cost goes down, but we're simultaneously electrifying the planet. And what we do with those savings is, typically in a growth economy, we're encouraged to spend, right? So we're saving money on our electricity bill, but now we can fly to Hawaii or Mexico or have another trip or buy another gadget. And so at the end of the day, we're still consuming as much or more than ever before.
Ecological footprint analysis. The technique that we've developed at UBC, my students and I, over some couple of decades actually, and it's still ongoing, is a simple notion that we can look at any person or any nation's flows of energy and material and follow that back through the production cycle to land and water ecosystems. So if you think of yourselves, you are probably wearing a cotton, this happens to be wool, these are cotton pants. I'm standing on a wooden stage, you're sitting on chairs made out of petroleum byproducts and so on and so forth. There's nothing in the room, including your bodies, that can't be traced back through the economic production cycle to an ecosystem somewhere. So it occurred to me way back in the 70s that if I could measure the amount of the ecosystem area required to sustain just me, I'd have an idea of what I now call my personal ecological footprint. On the planet today, there are about 13 or 14, well, it says 12, it's getting smaller, billion hectares of biophysically productive land and waterscape. Divide that by the 7.2 billion people, and you come up with a number around 1.7. On Earth today, there are 1.7 hectares of biophysically productive land and waterscape per person. Interestingly, if you do a survey of the mention of growth in the economics literature, it doesn't even show up until the 1950s. Growth was not an element, a platform in the any political parties, what am I saying? It was not a plank in the platform of any political party until well into the 1950s. So it's that recent a phenomenon in terms of a public dialogue and mission in the post-war period. That's when it happened. And yet we take it now to be the norm and the only way that we can go.
But here's the assumption, is that growth is synonymous with good. So, you know the phrase, a rising tide lifts all boats. So one of the challenges, though, is that it only really lifts some boats. Right? We live in a world where the bottom billion are still the bottom billion. They might as well be anchored to the seafloor as the tide rises above their heads, and probably will. And so we have this paradox where we are conditioned to believe that wealth should be created, right? You are doing good if you're creating jobs, stimulating the economy, and we shouldn't be redistributing, giving people handouts. Let's just all get in there and work for it. And what this overlooks is the phenomenon of allometric growth of the Pareto law, which states that some individuals have a certain advantage that they can exercise that gives them a greater share in consumption than their representative proportion. Okay? The equivalent is the small dog with the big bone, right? If I am competitive and I have advantage in the market, for every round of transactions, I will gain more and accumulate more to myself. So we end up in a situation where we have grown, the economy has grown 20-fold, while the population has only grown 4-fold in the last century. So there's $5 more per person, even with this incredible population explosion. There's more money circulating amongst all of us than ever before. Or is it? No, right? All of the money, not all of the money, but most of that money is circulating between the hands of a very small few with allometric or Pareto advantage. So you end up with a situation where 20% of the global population is consuming 80% of the world's resources. That also includes us in Vancouver. And 80% of the world is living off the remaining 20% and less. So economic growth is really just driving this or exacerbating this inequitable distribution of resources.
So we have to recognize that previous cycles of human cultures have followed a pernicious pattern. I'm not making this up. Refer to a book called The Collapse of Complex Societies.